My wife, Rachel, left me for a stranger. My younger brother, Gavin, stood by me for the entire year that followed. Then, almost a year after Rachel left, I found out she was pregnant. I drove straight to Gavin's house because he was still the person I went to when something knocked the air out of me. While he showered, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Rachel's name was on the screen. Her message said, "I'm happy to do this with you." I stared at it long enough for the screen to dim. Then it lit up again. Another message from my ex-wife. I picked up Gavin's phone. A few minutes later, I was pounding on the bathroom door so hard my hand hurt. He opened it with a towel around his waist, water running off his hair. I shoved the phone toward him. "What the hell is this?" His face changed before he even looked at the screen. That was the moment I knew whatever explanation I was hoping for wasn't coming. "Gavin." He stood completely still. Then my brother looked me in the eye and said, "I didn't want you to find out this way." We had. And that was where the life I thought I understood finally split open. But to understand why that phone almost made me sick, you have to understand what Gavin had been to me before I picked it up. A few years earlier, his own life had gone sideways. A relationship ended. His finances were a mess. His lease was up, and he needed somewhere to land while he figured things out. I owned a modest 3-bedroom house I'd bought in my late 20s. It had been my first real adult purchase, the place where I'd learned how expensive water heaters were and how quickly a small roof leak could turn into a weekend project. By the time Gavin needed help, Rachel and I had moved into another home together, so the old house was sitting there. Gavin asked if he could stay temporarily. I tossed him the keys. 3 months. Get yourself straight. He laughed. 3 months. Promise. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. Eventually, Gavin started paying me $600 a month. Comparable places in that area were renting for more than $2,000. I knew that. Gavin knew that. Rachel definitely knew that. Once, after we had dinner with him, Rachel looked at me while we were driving home and said, "You know you're basically giving him that house." I shrugged. "He's my brother." She looked out the passenger window for a second, then smiled. "You're too good to people sometimes." I remember that sentence now for very different reasons. At the time, there was nothing strange between Rachel and Gavin. At least nothing I could see. We'd been married 7 years. Gavin had been around for all of it. He came to barbecues. He ate Thanksgiving dinner with us. He helped me replace a section of fence. Rachel would make fun of his taste in movies. Gavin teased her about putting decorative pillows on every piece of furniture we owned. They acted like siblings. That was the shape I had put their relationship into in my head, so every interaction passed through that filter. During the last year of my marriage, Rachel changed slowly enough that I could explain each thing away by itself. She stayed out later. She became protective of her phone. She started taking more errands alone. Some nights, she'd tell me she was meeting a friend and come home after I'd already gone to bed. When I reached for her in the morning, there was always something she needed to do. Laundry, coffee, a shower, anything that got her out of my arms without making it obvious she was avoiding them. I noticed. I just thought we were having a bad year. 7 years into a marriage, you don't assume every quiet dinner means somebody is cheating. At least I didn't. I tried to fix whatever I thought was wrong. I suggested weekends away. I cooked more. I asked whether she was unhappy. Rachel always gave me just enough reassurance to keep me from pushing harder. "I'm tired. Work's been a lot." "We're fine, Nolan." Then one evening I came home, and she was already sitting at the kitchen table. No television. No food. Her hands were folded in front of her like she'd rehearsed where to put them. I knew before she spoke that something was coming. She waited until I sat down. "I can't do this anymore." I stared at her. "Do what?" "This. Us." She said it quietly. That somehow made it worse. There was no explosion I could fight back against. She sounded like she was informing me that a decision had already been made somewhere without me. I asked the question I think most people would ask. "Is there somebody else?" Rachel didn't answer. Her eyes dropped to the table. That pause was long enough. "Rachel." She finally looked at me. "Yes." One word. 7 years compressed into one word. I felt my hands go cold. "Who?" She shook her head. "I'm not doing that." "What does that mean?" "It means knowing who he is won't make this easier. It would make it honest." Her jaw tightened. "It would make everything worse." I remember staring at her and trying to understand what that meant. I thought maybe he was married. Maybe somebody we worked with. Maybe his wife would find out. Maybe there was some complicated situation Rachel was trying to protect. Anything except the truth. I asked again. She refused again. 2 weeks later, she moved out. The first person at my door that night was Gavin. He showed up carrying takeout I hadn't asked for. I hadn't eaten all day. He put the bag on my counter and said, "You're eating something." I told him I wasn't hungry. He opened the containers anyway. That first month, he was everywhere. When I couldn't sleep in the bedroom Rachel and I had shared, Gavin told me to come over. I spent several nights on his couch. I would wake up at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, wondering who she had chosen over me. Gavin would sometimes still be awake. One night, I sat at his kitchen table while he drank coffee, even though it was after midnight. "I keep picturing this guy," I told him. Gavin rubbed a hand over his face. "Stop giving some coward space in your head. I just want to know what he had that I didn't." "Nothing. You don't know that. I know any guy who'd sleep with a married woman isn't worth destroying yourself over." That line stayed with me. I actually repeated it to myself later. That's how convincing he was. Another night, after too much coffee and almost no sleep, I told him, "If I ever find out who he is, I don't know what I'll do." Gavin leaned forward. "Forget him. Get your life back." So I tried. Then the money started surfacing. During the separation, I went through accounts Rachel and I had both used and found nearly $30,000 of debt and charges I hadn't fully understood were there. Some of it was normal overspending that had gotten out of control. Food, shopping, subscriptions, trips, things we should have been watching more carefully. But there were other charges I couldn't place. Restaurants I hadn't been to, delivery orders, home furnishings, a mattress. At that point, I was exhausted enough that every statement looked like another accusation. Gavin sat with me one Saturday and helped sort bills across his dining table. He made piles. He wrote amounts down. He helped me figure out what needed immediate attention and what could wait. At one point, when I was squeezed hard enough that I was moving money between accounts just to stay ahead of everything, Gavin gave me some money. I tried to refuse it. He pushed it back toward me. "You'll do the same for me someday." I almost laughed. "I already charged you $600 for a whole house." He smiled. "See? We're even." I believed him. That was the part that messed with me later. Rachel had betrayed me once. Gavin had watched me experience that betrayal from inches away and built himself into the person I trusted most because of it. The divorce took most of the next year to finally settle into something I could live with. I stopped asking mutual friends about Rachel. I stopped checking whether she had changed her picture. I stopped waking up every morning with the first thought being that my marriage had failed. There were still bad days, but they stopped owning entire weeks. Then, almost a year after Rachel left, a mutual acquaintance mentioned her pregnancy. It wasn't delivered dramatically. We were talking about something else when the person hesitated and said, "You know Rachel's expecting, right?" My stomach tightened. I said I hadn't known. Later, against my better judgment, I looked. There she was. A pregnancy photo. Rachel smiling with one hand over her stomach. No obvious father in the picture. No name. Nothing that answered the question she had refused to answer a year earlier. But suddenly the stranger wasn't just some shadow hanging over the end of my marriage. Rachel was building a family with him. I closed the picture. Opened it again. Closed it. Then I grabbed my keys. I didn't think about where I was going. I drove to Gavin. He opened the door and took one look at my face. "What happened?" "She's pregnant." He froze. Only for a second. At the time, I thought I had surprised him. Now I know I had terrified him. He stepped aside. "Come in." I walked into the kitchen and dropped into a chair. Gavin stood across from me. I expected the usual questions. "How did you find out? Are you okay?" Instead, he said, "You want to grab something to eat?" I looked at him. "I just told you my ex-wife is having a baby." "I know. I'm just saying sitting here staring at the wall isn't going to help." That sounded like him. That sounded like the brother who had gotten me through the last year. So I nodded. "Fine." He said he wanted to shower first. I stayed in the kitchen while the water started down the hall. His phone was on the counter beside his keys. It buzzed. I barely looked. Then I saw the name. Rachel. The message preview said, "I'm happy to do this with you." Every thought in my head seemed to stop at once. I stared at the screen. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Rachel had reached out because she knew Gavin still spoke to me. Maybe they were planning something involving the family. Maybe. The phone buzzed again. "I know you're scared about Nolan, but I'm done hiding." My chest went tight. I knew Gavin's passcode. I'd known it for years. He knew mine too. Brothers. I entered it. The conversation opened. The newest messages were about appointments. Baby names. Things they needed to buy. There were pictures of Rachel. Messages from Gavin telling her to rest. Rachel calling him dad in a joke about the baby. That should have been enough. It wasn't. My thumb kept moving upward. I needed to know when. Weeks became months. I passed the day my divorce became final. They were together. I passed Christmas. Together. I reached the period when Rachel had just moved out. Still together. My breathing became shallow. I kept scrolling. Then I crossed the date she had sat across from me at our kitchen table and said there was somebody else. The messages kept going. Before the separation. Before she said our marriage was over. Months before. Then I found the exchange that killed the last innocent possibility. Rachel had written. He asked me again who it is. Gavin replied. Don't tell him. He'll never forgive either of us. Rachel. I hate watching you pretend you don't know. Gavin. It's temporary. I read those 4 messages 3 times. I could hear the shower running. I could hear my own pulse. Suddenly, I was seeing a year's worth of conversations from the other side. Stop giving some coward space in your head. Forget him. Get your life back. Any guy who'd sleep with a married woman isn't worth destroying yourself over. I grabbed the phone and walked down the hallway. By the time I reached the bathroom, I was shaking. I hit the door with my fist. Gavin, the water stopped. What? Open the door. Nolan, give me a second. I hit it again. Open the damn door. He opened it with a towel around his waist. I held up the phone. What the hell is this? His face drained. He looked at the screen and then at me. I didn't want you to find out this way. We had what? He swallowed. We had no idea how to tell you. I actually laughed. It came out ugly. How long? Nolan. How long? It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How long? He reached for the phone. I pulled it away. How long, Gavin? His shoulders dropped. Months before she left. Something inside me went quiet. I stared at my brother. You sat with me in this kitchen. He said nothing. You let me sleep on your couch. Nolan, I know. You listened to me talk about the guy. I know. You were the guy. He looked down. I wanted to hit him. I didn't. What came out instead surprised even me. Where? His eyes lifted. What? Where did you sleep with her? He went still again. I looked past him. Down the hallway. Toward the bedroom. Here. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I walked away from him. For the first time in years, the place stopped looking like Gavin's house. I saw the walls I had paid to repair. The kitchen cabinets I had repainted. The couch where I had sat crying over Rachel while Gavin listened. The hallway Rachel must have walked down while she was still my wife. My house. The house I had let my brother live in for $600 a month because I thought family loyalty worked both ways. Then I remembered the mattress. About 18 months earlier, Gavin had replaced the old one in his bedroom. He'd called me because he needed help getting the new mattress upstairs. I had come over. We turned it sideways in the stairwell, swore at the railing, laughed when we nearly dropped it, and finally shoved it through the bedroom door. Gavin had told me he'd gotten a great deal. I thought about the credit card statements. The furniture charge. Same period. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. Later, I dug through the old statements and the receipts still sitting in our old shared email account. There it was. The furniture store charge was on our joint card, and the matching order confirmation was under Rachel's name for the same mattress Gavin had brought home that month. I sat at my desk staring at the charge and receipt. I own the house. I subsidized Gavin's rent. I helped carry the mattress upstairs. And Rachel had helped pay for the bed with money I was now paying back. That realization didn't make me explode. It burned through whatever part of me was still looking for a way to understand them. I cut contact with both of them. For a few weeks, I heard things through my parents. Gavin was sorry. Rachel wanted to explain. They never meant to hurt me. The affair became real only after the separation. That last claim didn't survive the messages I had already read. After they realized there was no story they could tell me that would erase the dates, their tone changed. Rachel started staying openly at Gavin's place. Then she effectively moved in. My parents were horrified by what Gavin had done, especially after they learned the affair started before my marriage ended. But Rachel was pregnant. That changed the way every conversation ended. My mother called me one night. I'm not asking you to forgive him today. I'm not forgiving him tomorrow either. I know you're angry. This is bigger than angry. She was quiet. Then she said, that baby didn't do anything. I know. And I meant it. I had no issue with the child. The child hadn't lied to me. The child hadn't sat across from me while I talked about my marriage falling apart. The child hadn't used my property as a place to betray me. I told my mother exactly that. I also told her I wasn't discussing Gavin anymore. For a while, that worked. Then I arranged with Gavin to stop by the property for a maintenance issue. When I walked in, I heard movement in the spare bedroom. Gavin came into the hall. He looked uncomfortable, but didn't ask me to leave. I stepped closer to the spare room. There were paint cans on the floor, crib boxes against the wall, tiny clothes stacked inside an open plastic container. A changing table was half assembled. I looked at Gavin. What is this? He glanced toward the room. The nursery. I almost thought I'd misheard him. In my house. His face hardened. That was new. The shame he'd shown when I caught him was disappearing. In its place was something worse. Entitlement. Nolan, come on. No. Explain it. I've lived here for years. For $600. I pay you every month. You pay less than a third of what this place could rent for. He rubbed both hands over his face. Rachel is pregnant. We need a room for the baby. Then rent a house with a room for the baby. His jaw tightened. This is our home. I heard those words clearly. Our home. I looked past him at the nursery, at the fresh paint, at boxes they had carried into a property I owned. My brother had taken the generosity I gave him and quietly converted it into a right. Somewhere along the way, Nolan lets me live here had become, this belongs to us. He must have expected me to start shouting. Instead, I nodded. Okay. His expression changed. Okay. Yeah. I walked out. That night, I pulled every document I had for the house. The property was mine. I had bought it before the marriage. Gavin's arrangement was month to month. I checked the required process carefully. I checked it again. Then I began the lawful termination of his tenancy. After that, I contacted an agent. The house went on the market. Gavin called as soon as he realized I was serious. You're selling the house? Yes. With Rachel pregnant? Yes. What the hell is wrong with you? I sat at my dining table listening to him speak as if I had invaded his property. You knew I owned it. You know what I mean. I really don't anymore. You're punishing a baby because you're mad at us. I'm ending your tenancy. You're throwing your family out. You have notice. You have time. You're both adults. He lowered his voice. You won't actually do this. That told me more than the yelling. He truly believed I would stop. For years, whenever Gavin struggled, I helped. Housing, money, time, repairs. He had built his idea of me around one assumption. Nolan might get angry, but Nolan takes care of me. Rachel apparently believed the same thing. Because they kept building the nursery. They painted. They assembled the crib. A changing table arrived. Baby clothes accumulated in drawers. Gavin told relatives I was having a reaction and would eventually calm down. One comment made its way back to me. Once Nolan sees his niece or nephew, all of this is going to seem stupid. I sat with that one for a while. Apparently, the plan was for time, my parents, and an unborn child to turn consequences into cruelty. Meanwhile, people were walking through the house. Offers came in. I accepted one. The sale moved forward. I communicated exactly what I was required to communicate and nothing more. My mother called when she finally realized the sale wasn't a threat. Do you really have to sell it? Yes. Couldn't you rent somewhere else to them? I frowned. Why would I rent somewhere else to them? You know what I mean. Help them find something. They can find something. Nolan, Rachel is pregnant. I know. The baby is innocent. I know that too. She sighed. I just don't want you to regret doing something because you're hurt. That was the one time I explained it completely. I'm not taking anything from their baby. I'm stopping myself from giving something to its parents. My mother went quiet. I continued. Gavin lived in a house worth more than $2,000 a month for $600 because he was my brother. He used that house to sleep with my wife. Then he stood beside me for a year while I tried to recover from what they were doing. Now he calls the house theirs. Nolan, I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm not asking you to pick me. But I'm done paying for the privilege of being betrayed. She didn't bring it up again. The closing went through, with possession set to transfer after Gavin's move-out deadline. Once the paperwork was complete, something in me settled. The argument was over even though Gavin didn't seem to understand that yet. There was nothing left for him to convince me to do. Moving day came on a quiet morning. A truck pulled up outside. I went over because possession was changing hands that day and I wanted to make sure everything was handled. Boxes started coming through the front door. Gavin looked exhausted. Rachel was far enough along that the pregnancy was impossible to overlook now. She stayed mostly out of the way while things were carried outside. I didn't speak to her. I watched the house empty one room at a time. The nursery was the hardest room for them. The crib they had assembled came apart. The changing table went out. Boxes of baby clothes followed. Freshly painted walls appeared behind everything they removed. That room had looked permanent to them. By afternoon, it looked like an empty bedroom again. Then 2 movers came down the stairs carrying a mattress. I recognized it immediately. The same mattress I had helped Gavin wrestle up those stairs 18 months earlier. I stared at it. Gavin noticed. For a second, neither of us spoke. I nodded toward it. "Take that with you." His face tightened. "It's mine." "I know." The movers stopped, unsure whether there was a problem. I looked at Gavin. I already paid for it. He understood. His eyes dropped. The movers kept going. A little later, the buyers arrived. They were just ordinary people excited about a house they had legally purchased. They had no idea what the driveway had meant to anybody before them. One of them unlocked the front door. Gavin watched a stranger step inside. That finally seemed to make the sale real to him. He turned toward me. "You actually sold it." "Yes." He looked at the moving truck, then at Rachel, then back at me. "You're really doing this to your own brother?" I held his gaze. "You stopped using that argument before I did." His face went red. "Where are we supposed to go?" "Wherever you can afford." "So that's it." "That's it." He stepped closer. "So this is what you want? Your niece or nephew growing up knowing you threw us out?" I felt something old tug at me. The part of me that had always fixed things for Gavin. The part that heard family and immediately reached for its wallet, its keys, its spare room, its weekend. For once, I let that feeling pass without obeying it. "Your child didn't betray me." "You did." Gavin shook his head. "You've changed." "Yeah." He waited. So I gave him the only explanation he was getting. "For a year, you helped me learn how to live without my wife." He stared at me. "Now you can learn how to live without my house." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I got into my car. Behind me, the new owners walked through their front door while Gavin and Rachel's boxes sat beside a moving truck. Then I drove away. Gavin and Rachel ended up renting an ordinary apartment. The biggest shock for Gavin wasn't the size. It was the rent. $600 had hidden a lot from him for years. Real rent, utilities, baby expenses, deposits, and everything else arrived at once. They stayed together. I was glad they did. There was something fitting about that. No secrecy left. No cheap house supplied by me. No brother cleaning up the edges of their decisions. Just the life they had chosen. The house sale gave me enough to finish cleaning up the financial wreckage from the marriage and keep something for my own future. My parents eventually stopped trying to pull me back into Gavin's life. I never asked them to cut him off. I simply stopped participating. And that ended up being the part that mattered most. For years, he's my brother, had been my reason for giving Gavin more than I ever would have given anyone else. I finally understood that brotherhood couldn't be an obligation that only ran in one direction. Rachel betrayed my marriage. Gavin betrayed something I had never thought I needed to protect. He knew exactly how badly I was hurting because he was the one holding me together while hiding the truth. In the end, I didn't need to destroy the life they were building. I just stopped using my own money, my own property, and my own loyalty to hold it up. I used to think the worst part was finding out who Rachel chose. It wasn't. It was realizing how long I had mistaken silence for loyalty. Losing both of them hurt, but finally choosing what I would no longer carry felt like getting my own life back. If you've ever watched somebody mistake your kindness for something they were entitled to, you know how heavy that realization can be. Like the video and subscribe for more stories where the truth eventually catches up.